Okay, folks, so as I promised, one of the conversations it's been happening for decades is this whole thing about, subsidizing trains. Why are we subsidizing these money-losing trains? I hear it all the time, and it drives me bananas. And one of the things I say when I present around the country or here in D.C., I always say it's not about whether a route makes money. It's about who the route makes money for. And so we really wanted to kind of arm all of you with the pieces of that conversation so that when you're having these talks tomorrow, you have some of these in your toolbox. Excuse me. So we're going to talk briefly about how trains make money and how we have invested in some modeling tools here at the association, such as IMPLAN, that let us map out the economic benefits of train service. And I think that that's a key way of shifting the conversation. So we're not talking about we need these trains. It's look at the benefits the trains provide. It's a little bit of a different story. So I'm going to turn it over to Abe for a few minutes.
All right. So you may have seen our press releases. $180 million hole across New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas should we replace the Southwest Chief with buses. If Minnesota, conversely, were to add a train between Chicago and Minneapolis in addition to the Empire Builder, that state would see $25 million annually added to its economy in a myriad ways, only for the operational fee of about $2 to $3 million to run the train. These are really compelling ideas, and how do we arrive at them? How can we say these things? Well, we started with something that we've been doing for a long time. So, who here recognizes this, what these are? I would hope to see more hands than that, quite honestly. Yeah, because these are really important. The people across the country use our Amtrak fact sheets, and we've been making them for a long time, thanks to a couple of really hardworking members. We have reporters call in for them all the time. We've got policymakers that they're distributed to through you guys, and we found different ways to use them that are pretty interesting. And one of the people responsible for making them is here. He's standing up right now. His name is George Chilson. And he offers a huge round of applause for helping us compile this information every year. And so one of the trains in question, the Southwest Chief, we can see, or perhaps we can see with those of us with magnifying glasses currently, that last year the train carried 327,000 people. Now, we're really good at talking about sheer numbers, but what do they mean? What does it mean if this train carries 327,000 people across the country? Well, let's dive a little deeper. Earlier this year, George also did something kind of interesting with the sheer ridership numbers that we have been using for years. And what he did is he aggregated them. So this gives us a better idea of what the system does when we compare trains to each other, right? And these are pretty interesting too. Because if you look at passengers to departure and seat miles sold, what's interesting is that the long-distance trains, train per train, actually act a lot more like Northeast Corridor trains than they do by state-supported trains. The really important distinction, of course, is the fact that state-supported trains tend to enjoy far more frequencies, which help for their overall business lines. Now, this is interesting because the long-distance trains, of course, have hundreds and hundreds of station pairs, which make up for it. And I think that this is what draws so much demand of them comparatively. However, again, we know this about the lines. We can see some of the strange qualities of the trains operating within each other. We know how to talk about it train for train. But how do we talk about it when we look at trains actually operating in the world around them? So let me ask, who in this room knows where this is? Who can say? Very good. Yeah, exactly. It's the California Zephyr coming out of Moffett Tunnel on the way to Denver, which you can see above each other, barely there, the skyline. This is sort of a representation for what we are all going to do right now. We're all going to take a trip. When the California Zephyr comes out of Moffett Tunnel, you can see the state of Colorado as well as the city of Denver like a postcard stamp. So at first, we're going to take a broad overview of how we've been looking at the numbers and the models we've been using and how we've been arriving at some of the conclusions to be able to say some of these big things. However, we're also going to get a little closer and lower down into until we finally arrive at the station in Denver. And by that, I mean we are going to break the information down to a point where I think we're going to arrive in an environment where you can all talk about what we've been doing in a pretty easily understandable and cogent way. And so pretty much we're going to take one of the most beautiful trips in this country, which is coming out of the Rockies down into Denver together. So with that, we did a bit of a reach out. Now we work in a small niche world. We started with the ridership analyses that we normally do, but passenger rail analysis is in this country it's a small world, and we reached out to our friends Transportation from America, as well as Mayor John Robert Smith, who I'm sure many of you would recognize, to some of the work they did with the University of Mississippi, because they happened to conduct a study that was, we thought, pretty excellent. It looked at what would happen if you resurrected Gulf Coast rail service. And the models were pretty interesting. And so we looked into who created this and who talked about that service. And it was this wonderful doctor, Yvonne Zhang, who we worked with pretty closely to create the model that we now use. Now, she, of course, specializes in transportation-related economic development down there, and now she is a passenger rail expert for that university, given some of this work that she's done with Transportation for America and now us. So, we built a platform with her. We collaborated pretty intensively. We all, chugged through about 40 different recent papers to talk about the ways that transportation, and especially passenger rail, affects the environment around it. And we defined the impacts to derive benefits, which we'll go through in the next slide. We also contracted with a software called Implan. And without getting too much into the weeds, because it's very easy to when you look at Implan, it's essentially a calculator for looking at what happens when you put a certain amount of money in the economy. It calculates the total benefit for what activities that creates and how many jobs it then takes to support that. And so it creates a multiplier, region specific. So we would say things like, well, we're going to restore a station. We're going to spend $40 million, for instance, to restore King Street Station in Seattle. Well, what does that mean? How many jobs does that create, and how many spin-off industries does it support? Because at the end of the day, when you spend $40 million on King Street Station, it ends up being a lot more than that in the local economy. And we really wanted to talk about that larger number as well. It's pretty standardized. It uses Bureau of Labor Industry Statistics. It was actually invented for the U.S. Forestry Service. It's used by universities and Fortune 500 companies across the country. It's very reliable. So, with that, the characteristics that we defined with Dr. Zhang, we can say that passenger trains do make money. And we can say, of course, the joke is the fact that they just don't make money for the railroads that operate them for the most part. The direct quantifiable benefits that we looked at and are pretty confident that we can define are the direct impact through the Amtrak that money spends through railroad operations and maintenance spending on local economies. The one I'm probably most excited about, which is new visitor spending, which is very interesting, and we'll get into that a bit later, as well as property development values around the train stations, which is another concept that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The indirect ones are also pretty interesting. Passenger trains are very clean, so if you take people off of roads and out of the sky, you're saving pollution abatement costs. Cars are really dangerous, and we kill a lot of people every year using them. And so every person you take out of a car, there are many costs associated with the statistical average that you're now saving, because cars are so very deadly in this country that if you take any significant number of people out of them, you end up saving lives. Highway maintenance avoided is another one that we'll go into, as well as save travel costs. In a lot of parts of the country, Amtrak is extremely affordable. And this really does add up for especially rural places. One thing I should mention is that these don't apply to every single route we look at. For long-distance trains, for instance, with apologies to Meridian, Mississippi, community development and property values don't always rise around them because of the frequency. Conversely, on the Northeast Corridor, I don't think anybody will ever accuse it of saving travel costs for anybody. So, our first direct collaboration with USM and Dr. Zhang. Pretty interesting results. We found, of course, that the chief would leave, again, $180 million hole in parts of those states. Using numbers that Amtrak derived itself from losing 100,000 passengers along the corridor, we learned that about $5 million would be lost in visitor spending from the 30,000 riders who would no longer travel with that option. And there'd be about a 70% increase in pollution control for the 3 states affected, just for highlight approaches. The paper goes into a ton of different stuff, and I recommend you to look at it. It's available on our website. It's been trumpeted for quite a while. It's right there at that link. Our first independent effort was working with Minnesota to really look at a second train and what it would do for Minneapolis. And I'm including a pie chart that you're going to get pretty familiar with here. It's a pretty important one. And it, again, comes from public data that's right on the Amtrak website, and I think it's really interesting, and I want you all to really familiarize yourself with it. Here it's specified for 3 states, but we're going to look at it at a national level as well. Overall, again, $25 million from a $2 to $3 million annual investment in the operation of a passenger train service. And again, from looking at what people would do without a train, and because Amtrak said it would add 155,000 riders to the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin, should the train be added, we can then deduce that 90,000 drivers would then divert to train service, and it would save the state quite a bit of money. It would save, on average, about $1.8 million, conservatively estimated through market-based costs. And so this just means car crashes and medical bills. We're not even trying to account for pain and suffering. And then about $20.8 million in saved maintenance, given the fact that, again, these things are really expensive, and putting train costs into perspective with what we spend on transportation is exactly what we're trying to do. We often joke, how many trains could we buy with one freeway cloverleaf? And well, that would buy most of the Amtrak system in some cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive into a couple of sample calculations. Like I said, we are still, don't worry about this, we are still way up in the Rockies. We are looking out over the plateau here, so we're not down at ground level just yet. But I want to walk you through this just so you can see that this is actually pretty defensible and it's not that complicated. From Amtrak, we know that the induced ridership along the corridor across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota is about 9%. 59% driving and 11% taking the bus. So we know that 9% of that 155,000 people would not travel should the train not exist. We further know from Amtrak that about 46% of people getting off in the state of Minnesota are tourists, otherwise known as people from out of state. So these people are going to be spending money when they hit Minnesota. We then took data from Explore Minnesota, which is the tourism institute for the state. Now, that's important because every state has one of these things. In fact, some counties have them, and they have got great data, and it's very easy to use. From them, we know that the average daily spend of people visiting Minnesota is about $140.17. We know that they stay on average for 3 days. That adds up to a direct cost, to a direct spend. These people that normally wouldn't travel in Minnesota, to about $845,000 for people on the new train, and current Empire Builder visitors spend about $1.7 million. Furthermore, from Explore Minnesota, we know that the tourists in Minnesota tend to spend about a quarter of the money on shopping. They spend about a quarter of their money on food. They spend another quarter on recreation, and then the rest is split up between ground transportation and lodging. And so through IMPLAN, what we did is we took the gross amount of spending that we estimated, and we said, okay, IMPLAN, how much lodging, shopping, food, etc., these passengers are going to buy? What is the total footprint of that spending? And we found that IMPLAN thinks that the Empire Builder, the Baby Builder visitors would spend about $2.8 million annually in the state, and the Empire Builder visitors currently create about $6 million in overall impact every year. Now, you got to look at this. This is a small fraction, and this is very conservative. These are people that would not be in the state should the train didn't exist. The actual tourist spend that the Empire Builder and the Baby Builder would create would be a lot more, but we're just assuming that those people would have come anyway by flying or driving, or to a much smaller extent, taking the bus. If we extrapolate that to the Southwest Chief, we're going to get a peek into what IMPLAN actually gives us. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, although I can certainly answer questions about it after the fact. It's pretty cool because we're able to tell the total overall output. So we can tell the Southwest Chief creates about $9.6 million in tourist spending each year. But then we also look at it and we can say, okay, so not only that, but just through tourists that are using the train, they create about 107 jobs that are dependent on tourist spending that originates from the train along its corridor. We can also say that, well, to all the local states and counties, the train creates about $500,000 of tax income every year from people that would travel no other way, people that the train induces to come to the area. Second calculation is going to come up with this pie chart again. I told you you'd become familiar with it. This time, we're taking a much larger slice of the pie. We're looking at about 60% of the people that would take this train, and we're taking them directly off the road. And so then we create a calculation called vehicle miles traveled avoided. It's very important. So we look at the travel distance, which is data that we have, and we multiply it by passengers that would normally drive. That gives us our total vehicle miles traveled avoided. There's another great resource here with a name that some of you may be vaguely familiar with. The Victoria Transport Policy Institute, which employs a SAGE member of this organization, our very first intern, Anthony Pearl, who interned here back in the 70s and is now a very accomplished doctorate. He works there, and every year they come up with a fantastic summary of transportation costs. You can really dive down into this, and there's all sorts of fascinating data. But we chose one of the most conservative measures at how to look at the amount of damage comes from highway crashes every year. It's just market-based. About 12 cents per mile is the cost that we would assign to every vehicle mile avoided that then adds up to cleaning up crash sites and medical bills that no longer have to be paid.
Can I jump in on that
Please.
just for a second?
Yeah.
And I want to point out that is the 12 cents per mile is an extraordinarily conservative number. The Department of Labor actually has a figure that they use called the statistical value of a life saved. Has anybody heard that number before? Okay. It sounds kind of morbid, but the statistical value of a life saved calculates whether if someone dies in a highway crash, there's medical bills, there's loss of income to the family, there's the family having to get some other kind of form of support, and it ripples out. And so they adjust that figure every year. They have some econometricians who do that. And the Department of Labor says that the statistical value of one life saved is over $9 million. So when you see things like 100 people didn't get killed in this past year based on highway crashes or whatever it is, that's what they're using that number to calculate the value of that avoided accident. We don't use that number. If we used that number, these numbers would be much larger.
Precisely. And there are some estimates. It ranges from about 12 cents per mile to about $3 per mile saved for the overall outlying costs of vehicle miles taken off the road. So we went way to the conservative edge there. If we, again, bring this back to the Southwest Chief fatalities avoided, we looked at it across all the states in question, and then we looked at the overall loss in ridership, about 100,000 people that would be taken off the train should it get bust. Now, this is really important because there's a few different ideas happening here. The major thing is that, so if we bust that section of the Southwest Chief, you're looking at about a 30% increase in costs, which means a 30% increase in danger on the roads and people driving there. This is kind of fascinating too, because it really drives home the fact that when you look at this overall pie, and I'm going to go to the national number in just a moment, you notice that the way we use trains isn't exactly the perception. Only a small fraction of people on trains right now would take a bus. The overwhelming majority would drive. And there's a tremendous amount of costs that are assigned to that. I love to point this out. I just rewatched Goldfinger recently, James Bond movie from the 60s. And there's a great scene in it where James Bond and Goldfinger's gone over the plan for what he's going to do, and James Bond is outraged, and he goes, "Oh my God, you're going to kill 60,000 people needlessly." And Goldfinger goes, "American motorists kill that many every 2 years." And the thing is, we still do. We actually kill more than that. Even though we're safer per mile than we were back then, the overall number of people has actually gone up. And so that's something that we have to constantly remind ourselves. So this is the major question. When we look at the overall impacts that we explore here, operating and maintenance and visitor spending and development, we notice that most of them actually go back to how Amtrak passengers would travel without trains. Notice the link right there for where you can find these for every state. They're fabulous. The last date posted was 2016, which I think is recent enough where we can extrapolate the numbers to today. And it's a really important concept. This is what I want you guys to leave with, and we're going to play with these numbers in a bit here. So we're coming in to Denver Station. How did you guys come to this meeting today? How many came by train? How many came by train? Okay, big surprise. Big shocker there. Okay, yeah. How many came by car? Okay, 2 of you. How many people flew here? Okay, a reasonable number. It's a big country. Can't blame you there. How many by bus? Thank you. Honestly, but it's okay. It's a tiny number. So I should have qualified. It was inner city people, but that's fine too. Metro counts as a train.
All right.
Okay. So let's just imagine for a moment that the Amtrak network, all the nightmares occur. It either doesn't exist or it ceases to exist, and we're having this meeting. How would you guys have gotten here? How many people? Now think about this. Just the first thing that comes to your head. How many people would have driven here had that happened? Okay, fair number. How many people would have flown? Okay. How many people would have taken a bus for however long it would take? Okay, a few more. And then that's the most important part. How many people wouldn't come? Okay, now look at that. That's pretty tough, and it's also something to think about. Sort of a contradiction there. If there were no trains, you wouldn't come to lobby for trains. So okay, but the thing is, I'm not surprised that this group is full of outliers, because when you look at DC, and this is just completely shamelessly stolen from the Amtrak website. You look at the average split, and there's some interesting things to come here. On the second page of every economic impact report, you find these. So we got about 36% that would drive if Amtrak didn't exist here in DC. You got about 40% that would fly. You've got about 15% that would use a bus. You see that DC is a bit above average for if Amtrak was unavailable, people just wouldn't make the trip at all. And then what I love here is also the income distribution that's public. Now, for the Northeast Corridor and all the Acela passengers, the predominance of people making quite a bit of money isn't all that surprising. But, we were talking about the Empire Builder and the Baby Builder earlier today, so let's go somewhere very different. Let's think about a totally other part of the country, the state of Montana. Now look at this. 20% of the trips that go there would no longer exist if the train didn't run there. This is something you can just go to the website and find out. 20%. About 44% would drive. And how many people here are taking a bus? How many tourists is Montana losing out on if the Empire Builder doesn't go there? Precisely. But there are a couple of routes in some parts of it, but the survey results are indeed telling. What's also really interesting about this is the income distribution of people that are going to the state. You'll notice that if we toggle between the two, it's a little different. You have more wealth in DC, but honestly, the spread is still extremely diverse. If the Empire Builder vanished tomorrow, God forbid, about 52,000 people that make over $75,000 a year wouldn't go to Montana, and about 24,000 people wouldn't visit at all, depending. And so we're talking about pretty significant impacts. Now, not huge passenger numbers, but when you consider the fact that 52,000 is a lot more than whole cities in Montana, the impact is pretty clear. So let's play a game. Let's bring it back to the beginning here with the data that we're all relatively familiar with. Let's mash up together Amtrak's numbers and then George's fabulous grid here. If we look at that, that's how I derive those numbers. About 121,000 people last year in 2018. So all we need to do is multiply that by a percentage, and it tells you something really meaningful about the route. If you look at these two things, again, they're right online. Our ridership statistics, people will accuse us of burying them on our website, but you can see that the link is pretty simple. Also, the same is true for Amtrak's economic development sheets. You got to think about how things would look if the trains didn't exist, and it is not. It is totally contrary to popular perception. So, with that, I'm sure if I did this right, this conversation is going to launch 1,000 conversations, which I wanted to. You need to reach out to me for some of the more in-depth ones. We're developing a pipeline of how to do the more thorough analyses on different corridors around the country as we get the time and bandwidth to do so. But on top of that, we're certainly open, and I hope I got you to think about the train outside of the windows. So, with that, questions? Okay.
Gang, we are doing good work. This is a great staff. I'm trying to see who. Henry, I think you had your hand up first. This is impossible.
So, for that Washington, D.C. sheet, was that only Northeast Corridor passengers, or does that include, that's not
It's
DC?
it's everybody.
That is everybody.
it
Do
is-
we
it
have
is-
any
it's-
idea of what the difference is between, because I imagine, for example, the income spread of the long-distance passengers and the income spread of the Northeast Corridor passengers, and also, consequently, the alternative travel spread is going to be substantially different.
So here's the great thing about this, and this is, I'm so glad you asked that, Hendrik, because I want you to do this. I want you to go to our ridership statistics, because if you go ahead and pull one of these, where you look at them side by side, if you make a couple of small assumptions here and there, if you apply the ridership unilaterally across, look at the split of long distance versus state, which of course are broken out on the Matt Fells spreadsheets. You can actually kind of assess some of that. So I would say we need to get the numbers up in front of us and start having a conversation about them. Yeah. Oh yeah, I would think so too. Yeah. That's a very fair assumption, especially considering this, the strange predominance of business travel on that route as well. Yeah.
We're going to run out of time. I'm going to do two more questions, and then we do need to move on. Jared?
Jared Pearson from Tennessee. I think you can expand on all these great points with tourism and people not having alternatives by focusing on the medical industry, because a lot of people use the train to visit major medical centers like the Mayo Clinic and places like that. When you consider that for our purposes, talking to elected officials, that strikes an emotional chord when people are using rail services to get their extreme health care needs like cancer treatments and whatnot. And also when you consider the effect that the medical industry has on our elected officials. Let's talk dollars and cents here. That's a big part of their election campaigns. I'm being strictly political here, but we have in our organization talked about that very subject. We even had some numbers to look at recently. But I think going forward, if we can not just talk about tourism, but also talk about people who use these trains for essential medical services, we make a better point.
So you know what I just did? I just wrote it down, because it's a fabulous idea, and it isn't just political, but it's also fundraising. There's all sorts of ideas that go into that. That's a brilliant complexion. Yeah.
The one thing I would point out, though, is buried in our Southwest Chief study.
We do
actually address the degree to which we map out major medical facilities that would have been affected in the radius of patient travel and stuff like that. Mel, there's no way I can get to you unless I reach all the way over.
Got it. Thank you. In Saturday's Washington Post, they had Uber and Lyft going ahead full steam to try to get self-driving cars, which would mean Lyft and Uber would be far cheaper than it is today. And that might be 10 years away or 15. How would that affect Amtrak? More people would ride hailing.
Well, I would actually, so transit that's a giant conversation that is raging through the transportation research world at the moment. Amtrak, I mean, honestly, people aren't taking Uber from Pittsburgh to DC, so I don't think that self-driving Ubers are going to threaten them that much. In fact, in some places, having more reliable last-mile options might actually bolster Amtrak service. Oh yeah, I know exactly. You know, if you as a shameless plug for beer and transit, where we're going to talk about stuff just
So
like that.
we have to do one last question to keep us on time. Carl?
Abe, I apologize for apparently looking at my phone during your presentation. I was trying to find an old email of mine from 2013, which I just forwarded you. But we did an economic study of the impact of one single tour group on Lake Placid, New York, coming in because of the existence of the Adirondack Scenic Railroad, something which bad public policy in New York has now eliminated. And I gave you the facts on it, but we from a single bus, brought $71,000 worth of revenue into Lake Placid on one set of dates. And it was the kind of information that reinforces what you were saying. And I encourage you to share that. That is all I can prove, every penny of it, from actual accounting records. That this is a wonderful analysis, and this was exceptionally different than what we usually argue, and it's fabulous work.
Carl, thank you for saying that. Abe, you did a fabulous job. Abe Zumwalt is our Director of Policy Research.
It's only the start. We got a long way to go. Yeah.